ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ji ki fateh. Welcome to this segment of Khoj Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day. Our recitation today is the 14th Ashtapadi of Gauri Sukhmani, Mahalla Paila. And as always, we will start with the salok and then work our way down through the Ashtapadi. Salok Tajahu Sianap Sur Janahu, Simro har har raye, ek aas har man rakho, nanak dukh param pau jaye. So Nanak is saying, fix your awareness on the Har Self. And the Har Self is the sovereign. Simro har har rai. And it is addressing us as being wise ones, surjano, or at least seekers. So fix your awareness on the Har Self by taking leave of all conceptualization. Tajahu Sianap. This is really the art of intellectual conceptualization. And if you do that, all your travails, dukha, parama, pao, that is to say, sorrow, doubts, fears, will end. If you can learn to pin all your hopes on the Har Self, ek aas har man rakhe. So what we see here is that Gurmat privileges knowing by the heart over knowing by the intellect. That's the thing to understand here. Because this is not a conceptual process. The practice of Simran, which is the only effective way to transcend the limitations of the ego mind, is not a conceptual, not an intellectual process. That is the central thing to take away from the salok. And the Ashtapadi goes on to talk about those who are or have accomplished this process. And in the beginning, a word of caution for all of us. And the caution is, you need to understand that nothing is really in our hands. Manukh ke kish nahi haath. And the Ashtapadi goes, Manukh ki tek birthi sab jaan, devan ko ek hai Bhagwan. Understand that the self is the creator and the destroyer, and that nothing is in our hands. Therefore, Manukh ki tek birthi sab jaan. Understand that a reliance on people is in vain. So that is a message that we can all relate to. We have to be self-reliant. And the point that is also being made here is that not only can you set your expectations on others, because that is the surest way to disappointment, not to say that you can't completely not rely on others, you have to. But the deeper point, the more significant point is that on this path of Gurmat, you cannot rely on anybody else. You have to rely on yourself to actually make the journey. So manas ki tek birthi sab jaan. And you need to understand that the Creator, who destroys and creates and maintains, is the true sustainer. And it has provided us with all the provisions that we need to satiate our desires. Jiske diye rahe aghaye, bahur na trishna lage aaye. So what the Guru is saying is that self-knowledge, mindfulness, is what you need. It comes through the practice of Simran, which is really synonymous to mindfulness. It is a practice and a destination. So practice Simran to become fixed in Simran. So practice mindfulness to become fixed in self-awareness. Then nothing can stand in your way. Bigan na lage koi. And the second subsection. Ustat man mein kar nirankar, kar man mere sat vyavhar. Nirmal rasna amrit piyo, sada suhela, kar leho jiyo. नैन हो पेख ठाकुर का रंग, साध संग बिन से सब संग. चरण चलो मार्ग गोबिंद, मिटह पाप जपिए हर बिंद. कर हर कर्म श्रवण हर कथा, हर दरगह नानक उजल मथा. So it's addressing the mind, man mere, my mind. To walk on the path that leads to the self, which is Charan Chalo Marag Gobind, make sure that the self becomes your central business. Karman mere sat vyavhar, that should be your business. In other words, be focused. Exclude everything else. Don't be distracted. And then appreciate the fact that the formless one, Niranjan, which is not matter but the spirit, resides in your mind. You have to first, this is like an axiom that you have to work with, the axiom in mathematics. We have to appreciate that fact. And once we do that, we have to glorify that presence. Ustat man mein kar nirankar. And we do that by purifying the tongue, by drinking the elixir of Gurbani, Nirmal Rasna Amrit Piyo. This is refining your speech, your language. You see, this is all a process of refinement. And with the eyes, learn to behold the splendor of the Master's creation, Naino Pek Thakur Ka Rang. And in fellowship with the accomplished one, the Gur, the Sad, learn to be in the world but not of it. Sadh sang bin se sab sang, exclude everything else. It doesn't mean physical exclusion. It means being in the world but not of it. And follow the process of jap, simran, to overcome the errors of your ways. Mite paap, japiye har bind. So attune your mind to the narrative of the self, Sravan har katha, and dedicate all your actions to the self. Kar har karam. And Nanak says, in this manner, your way to the threshold of the self will be lit with the light of wisdom. Har dargah Nanak ujjal matha. Now you could translate this to mean that at the threshold, your face will reflect the radiance of self-knowledge within you, but I would think that you need light on a path that is otherwise very dark. So what we see here is, in the second section of the Ashtapadi, the Guru is trying to awaken the senses because we have become so robotic. We are asleep. We are insensitive. So to walk this walk, make it your business to focus on the self, so focus on that goal. Understand that the formless one is within, have that conviction, and glorify that presence by becoming awake, becoming sensitive in the senses. You know, our senses are quite dull. So that is why the Guru speaks of purifying the tongue or beholding the splendor of the Master's creation. Because we don't do that. We don't appreciate nature either. We're completely blind to the splendor of nature. So in a sense, we have to wake up. That is what is being said in this section of the Ashtapadi. And then it moves on to those who have actually glorified that self. Sada sada har ke gun ga. The Guru says, consider them to be the most prosperous and rich. Vadbhagi te jan jag mahe. In this world, know and understand this. And they who dwell and contemplate deeply on self-knowledge, Ram Naam jo karein bichar, they are the best of the best, the creme de la creme, if you will. And the Guru says, no, jane, understand that the one whose mind, speech, and thought reflects the herself, mantan mukh bolle har mukha, they have found eternal peace. Sada sada jane te sukhi. And those who have come to recognize the presence of the self in everything, eko ek pashanne, to them the mystery of existence is disclosed. This is self-disclosure. And so it is only that individual who has received the self-disclosure can grasp the self. So it is self-disclosure. Nanak tine niranjan janya. Now, how does that realization come? With the grace of Guru wisdom. Gur Prasad apan aap sujya. You realize the self, that formless presence within yourself. Sujya, discernment. And once that happens, that individual is freed from the thirst of desires, the pull of desires, Trishna, that fire. And in the fellowship of evolved company, Sadha Sangha Har Har Jas Kahat, the individual is healed of all mental perversions. Sarab rog te o har jana rahat. This is really the perversions of the mind, the prevarications of the mind, if you will, because our afflictions are mental and the mind is being addressed. So such an individual lives in a state of utter devotion, day in and day out. And in the midst of worldly engagement, such an accomplished person, a realized person, is actually removed from the world. Garistha mein soi nirban. So you don't have to leave your household. You don't have to leave your job. You don't have to go anywhere. This is all in the mind. This is noetic. And those who place their hopes on the self instead of placing reliance on others, other people, they lose their fear of death. Tisaki kate jamaki fasa. So those who hunger for the Supreme Self are freed from sorrow. So there has to be this hunger, there has to be focus, there has to be an awakening of the senses. This is all part of the practice of Simran. And so when the self comes to bloom in the mind, when that happens, jisko har prabh man chit ave, that person becomes a sant, the unruffled one, the one who is at peace. So sant sohela nahi dulave, it does not waver. So you're unruffled, you become that sant. And the Guru says, what fear can possibly disturb that one? So sevaka ke kis dare, who is bestowed with the compassion of the self. So this self-disclosure is an act of compassion. You see? And what happens then is that you realize, the Guru tells us at that stage, that the self is actually engaged in its own game. Apne karaj mein aap samaya. And then it reveals its true nature. Jaisa sa, taisa drishtaya. But this knowledge, the Guru cautions us, has to be assimilated through an unceasing search. Sodat sija. So there is effort involved until the essence is revealed by the Guru Enlightener, that last stage. Guru Prasad tat sab bujya, the essence of reality. And then what happens is that wherever you look, the self is seen at the root of all things. Jab dekhu tab sab kish mool. And Nanak says that mool, that self, is matter as well as mind. Nanak so sukham, so asthul, subtle and gross at the same time. That's the magic. Now this is the revelation that continues. Neh kis janmai, neh kis mare, apan chalat aap hi kare, आवन जावन दृष्ट अंदृष्ट आज्ञाकारी तारी सब सृष्ट आपे आप सगल में है आप अनेक जुगत रचथाप उथाप अबनासी नाही किछ खंड तारण तार रह्यो ब्रह्मंड अलख अपेव पुरख प्रताप आप जपाए ता नानक जाप. Seems to me this is probably the most significant Ashtapadi, the section of the Ashtapadi. And that is why I read it all out, because it is the revelation to the one who has received self-disclosure. And the revelation, nothing is born and nothing dies. It is the self acting in its own drama. Apan chalat aap hi kare. What comes and goes, the visible and the invisible, all of this obeys the busy hand of the self. Agyakari tari sabasrisht, all creation. The self is self-existent, meaning it is aloof, yet it is contained in everything. Ape aap, sagal mein aap. And it creates this existence and then destroys it, maintains it through various means. Sagal. And this self, the Guru tells us, is imperishable, not degradable. Abanasi, imperishable. Nahi kishikhand. It doesn't scatter, it doesn't fragment, it doesn't decay. It is the support of the universe. Taran tar reho brahmand. Now the self cannot be observed, it cannot be comprehended, but its splendor can be experienced. Alak apahev purakh, right? The purakh, this consciousness, is alak apahev, but pratap, splendorous. And the Guru has already told us that we need to awaken our senses to the splendor of this being. And says Nanak, to those who receive this gift, they can practice the presencing of the self. That is really where it's all at. They come to know the self as noble and honorable. Jin prab jata susobhavant. And by heeding their counsel, the counsel of those who are self-realized, humanity can save itself. Sagal sansar udare tin manth. They, meaning those who have received self-disclosure, are in the service of the self, relieving humanity of its suffering. Prabh ke sevak sagal udharan. And the self, in its mercy, has actually become one with its servant devotee. Ape melalai kripal. And they then flourish in self-knowledge. Gur ka sabad jap bhai nihal. And so the direction comes from the self. Jisno kripa kare padapagi, unki seva soi lagi. So they selflessly cling to service of humanity. And indeed they are fortunate, for they have been united with the spring of mercy, and this is a reference to the self. And in the end, there is this deep insight into the nature of the self and how we can get there, and what the goal of Gurmat is. Eventually, a devotee becomes indistinguishable from the self. Sada sada base har sang, and acts out of love of self. Jo kish kare sab prabh ke sang. A devotee, a servant, recognizes, has this recognition that whatever is happening, the real doer is the self. Karne har pashane soi. And so comes to accept. You see, because you see just the self everywhere, doing everything, you come to accept whatever happens as being in the due course of nature. Sahaj subhai hoye so hoye. Sahaj subhai. It's very natural. It has to happen because the action, the doer, is the self. And then the actions of the self become pleasing to the devotee. Prabhu ka kiya jan meet lagana. Because the devotee has this intuitive awareness. It can gaze upon the self and see it as it is, working through nature. They're at one with that treasure trove of virtue, or sukha nidhan unho bane aayi. And eventually, when the self honors the devotee, the self is honoring itself. This is profound. Says Nanak, know the master and the devotee servant to be one. Wow. On that note, until the next time, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.